Okay, welcome, those of you watching the ENSO seminar on YouTube. In case you, well, what I recommend you do is we're going to wait for about 5 minutes now so that anybody who wants to can join our live session. So you may want to fast forward till about 5 minutes in so that you don't have to watch us sit around and wait for people to join. And yeah, Tom, we'll just wait for a few minutes and see if anybody's going to join us this morning or evening or afternoon for you. What time is it for you again there? 2 o'clock?
2 p.m.
Yeah, 2 p.m. The perpetual struggle of trying to make time zones match for people distributed all around the world.
What happened to Merrick?
He said he's going to join us, but he said that
right.
he might be a little bit late. That's right, yeah. We've got one viewer.
How many
there.
seminars have you had so far?
That is a great question. I think we're on the order of about 15 or 16 now. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. You're number 18.
Okay. And the recordings stay online, right? Or
that's right. So all the live sessions get automatically turned into YouTube videos, which can be easily found on the ENSO Seminars website. And just a reminder, because I see now that we've got somebody joining the session, if you want to, you can participate live in our session so that you can ask questions that Tom can hear directly. And the way to do that is to send me an email. So matthew.egbert@gmail.com. Let me see if I can maybe bring up a slide that has information in these first few minutes. Okay, here I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you see that, Tom? Can you see the slide that I brought up now?
Yeah, that's showing some instruction with arrows.
That's right. So this just has some information for anybody who wants to join the session live. You can email me at that email address there on the left, or the other one that I just read out aloud. Either will work. And when I get an email from you, I can send you a link that will allow you to join the session and be able to ask questions live. But otherwise, we'll just hang out for another couple minutes.
I see my own comment there.
That's right. That's you commenting on whose talk?
On Mario's talk.
Mario's talk. That is actually something also worth mentioning is that even if you haven't been able to watch live or participate live, it's possible to continue the discussion on the ENSO Seminars website. So each talk can be pretty easily found in the previous presentations link. You can find the talk that you're interested in commenting on, click on that talk, and then go down to the bottom of that page. And there is a discussion forum, which is easy to get an account on and start some dialogue. And we've had some interesting conversations there in the past. This whole website is inspired a little bit by the old, what was it, the Life in Mind WordPress blog that we had going for a while back at Sussex, where there was some really great discussion that went on that blog. I think everybody's gotten a little bit busier and has less and less time to participate in that kind of discussion. But
unfortunately, so.
Unfortunately, yeah. The disadvantage of me having this slide up on my screen and broadcasting it to you all is it means I can't actually see how much time we have. Give it another moment or two, Tom, and then we'll get started if that works for you.
That's fine. Yes.
Okay. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Tom Froese, our speaker for the day. I had the pleasure of sitting in a desk next to Tom's at the start of my PhD and towards end of his in the Center for Computational Neuroscience and Robotics at the University of Sussex. And I think I have Tom to thank, at least in part, for pushing me towards enactive concepts in cognitive science and AI and artificial life and so on. So it's really a pleasure to have you here today, Tom. Thanks for agreeing to give a talk. And I'm looking forward to the topic as well. So if you're ready, I'll just ask you to take it away, and I'll mute myself, which can be a little bit disorienting. It sounds like you're talking to yourself in a computer on your own, but I'm still here and listening. So thanks again, Tom, and please take it away.
Thank you, Matthew, for the invitation and for the introduction. I'm gonna put this full screen now. Wait, let me share it. And to some extent, we've been having this dialogue for a long time, like you said. So it started in Sussex, but then you started actually working a lot on normativity while I was busy doing other things, and now I'm coming back to the topic, right? So it's really a kind of dialectic. So to some extent, I'm very interested to hear your comments on what I'm going to say, because it's partially based on the work that you've been doing in recent years. So here's the title, Normativity in a Dynamical World. Let's get started. First of all, let's just try to get an intuitive understanding of what normativity is. One way of putting it is that an activity, or an action, but activity more general, is more than just movement, right? Or to put it differently, movement is less than an activity. It lacks or misses something. For instance, an activity is someone doing something, like you are listening right now, and it is not just a process that is happening, like the Earth moving around the sun. And this is because activity is done for or in order to realize something. It could be a purpose, a goal, a desire, an intention, many different possibilities. And so, therefore, activity is normative because it can succeed or fail with respect to certain evaluative criteria. And this is kind of like the kind of broad definition that I'm going to adopt in this presentation. The upshot of this is that normativity offers guidance, right? Some activities will be good with respect to the criteria, while others are bad. And so you should be doing the ones that are good rather than the ones that are bad. So it seems to offer guidance for behavior. Now, philosophically, it's been very problematic to try to explain how to fit in normativity into a scientific perspective. Hota and Mine have talked about the hard problem of content, and they've been arguing that a broad appeal to representational content, such as having a goal, intention, desire, and so on, is problematic because the challenges of attempting to naturalize content in terms of conservative naturalism. So the question is, how can we fit something like the content of a desire or goal into the natural sciences? And the problem is, we can put it a little bit like this, because even if it were the case that content could be attributed, this content as such doesn't seem to do any causal work. So we can imagine that neural firing patterns in the brain, we might want to say that they represent the content of me having this thought right now. Or we might say the bacterium performing chemotaxis, its content is the goal of getting more nutrients, right? So, but the thing is that even if you attribute these kinds of contentful ascriptions to these processes, in the explanation of the unfolding of the processes themselves, for example, how the neurons fire, these contents don't make any appearance. Right? The neurons fire because certain chemical imbalances, in the cell membrane, for example. The content is not a thing or anything like that that can be measured. So they propose a kind of relaxed naturalism, and they say that it's better to say that content originates with certain social cultural practices, but even in that case, we still need an explanation of how this content could play a role in our activities. Right? And the same applies to more basic notions such as non-confrontal directedness. Being directed to the environment, how does that make a difference for the unfolding of the behavior? So this is not just some highly abstract things. Some of the key people in the field of complex systems research have struggled with this problem. So here's Stuart Kaufman in his book Investigations. And he says, once there's an autonomous agent, there's a semantics from its privileged point of view. An incoming molecule is yuck or yum, all right? So we have this alternative here. He says, I think that from the autonomous agent's perspective, yuck or yum is primary, unavoidable, and of the deepest importance to that agent. Without attributing consciousness to an E. coli, I cannot help but feel that the rudiments of value are present once autonomous agents are around. So he wants to go, there are two strong claims here. First of all, that there is an alternative, right? So it can be either yuck or yum. So I can either try to ingest it or expel it, for example. And that the difference between these two makes a difference to the agent, right? So it's not just something that we ascribe from the outside. Well, so how does the alternative come into play? And Kaufman struggles to explain this in his book. And it seems that in the end, he prefers to appeal to quantum mechanics as a source of alternative events. But somehow, you know, it doesn't fully work out. And I think we're still left with an open question of how alternative events could matter to an organism. So enactivism actually faces the same problem. They might not talk in terms of semantic content, but normativity is one of the hallmarks of recent research in enactivism. And it starts, for example, here with this definition of agency proposed by Barandiaran and colleagues, who give us a dynamical account. And they say an agent is an autonomous organization capable of adaptively regulating its coupling with the environment according to the norms established by its viability conditions. So that seems to suggest that here again we have this problem of that somehow what the agent does is guided by the norms, and somehow these norms play a role in how the agent regulates its coupling. But then when we look at work which tries to operationalize this definition a bit more in terms of simulation studies on the right-hand side of the screen, we see that really what we have here is just a division in state space. So we have here two axes, water and food, and the agent has to move in a state space trajectory in a certain region in order to keep surviving, right? So, but where are the norms here? I mean, we're drawing the box in the diagram, right? But it's not like the trajectory somehow has a choice or an alternative between doing something good or doing something bad for its persistence. So this difficulty has led some to suggest, like Abramova and Villalobos here, that perhaps enactivism is actually misguided in trying to appeal to normativity in the first place. So they say that something like Maturana and Varela's early version of biology of cognition could give us a better solution to these problems. Maturana has this metaphor that living organisms are pretty much like, like boats just floating and drifting on the sea without any direction, just being impinged upon by the physical forces. And in such a way, they don't have any alternatives. It's just something that's determined by its state and the state of the environment, right? So for them, any selection or directedness is only in the eye of the observer, who can envision how things could have been different of what their ultimate outcome turned out to be, right? But this is let's say, an illusion, right? It's not how things are actually happening in the real world. So, given these kind of three perspectives, appealing to semantic content, having a kind of dynamical account of normativity, or just saying normativity doesn't play any role whatsoever in the natural world, this leads us to the question, does normativity make a difference, right? Or to put it slightly differently, does the difference between an activity and a mere movement that I had at the beginning make a difference? And I suspect that most of us will agree that yes, it does. Right? But I also suspect that we may disagree about how normativity makes a difference. So the take-home message to some extent of this talk is that we can distinguish between several different kinds of yes, three that I'm going to distinguish here, and we should carefully evaluate their pros and cons. So here's the overview. I think normativity matters for most people, right? But here we have the disagreement. How much does it matter? Weakly, moderately, or strongly so? The weakly, yes. In this case, normativity matters because it provides us with a heuristic, higher-level description of physical processes that can be useful until we have a complete physical account. In this case, the status of normativity is that it's only extrinsically attributed, and the goal of science should be to try to replace normative descriptions with physical descriptions, right? So these would be more accurate descriptions, whereas the other ones are just heuristics. Examples of these positions are forms of behaviorism, reductionism, eliminativist materialism, and perhaps biology of cognition. So the pros and cons of this position, let's have a look. The key advantage is that it's not faced with the problem of having to try to naturalize normativity, right? So the hard problem of content doesn't even appear here because normativity is just said not to exist in the natural world in the first place. One key disadvantage is that it is an unstable position because the argument that normative claims should be replaced by physical descriptions is itself normative, right? So it's making a value judgment about how things should be. And phenomenologically, this position is in tension with our experience of acting normatively, and that this makes a difference to how we move, right? So to some extent, the way I feel about this position is that it leads us towards an untenable nihilism about the existence of self and others, right? So if we agree with Maturana, that would mean that when we encounter other people, we should treat them as nothing but you know, boats adrift at sea, where there's nothing in terms of the mental states, in terms of goals, desires, beliefs, that has any role to play in how they behave, right? So it's almost like a philosophical zombie style of account, so, which I think most of us would like to try to avoid. So that brings us to the moderate yes. In this case, normativity also matters because it provides an additional higher level of description of the physical processes that tells us something new about the agent. So it's not just a heuristic anymore for something, but it's actually giving us something extra. And yet a complete physical description of the causes of an action is in principle still possible. Here the status of normativity is that it can be an intrinsic property of the agent. It's not necessarily the case, but at least now intrinsic property is a possibility. And the goal of science should be to identify which kinds of systems lend themselves to be described normatively and why so, right? So we can here then now talk about the little model by Egbert and colleagues where certain regions of state space lend themselves to be described as normatively good, whereas others are not so. Some examples of this position. So we have Kant's natural purpose, Lenin's intentional stance, mind-body identity theory, and perhaps most versions of enactivism would also fall into this category. So the pros and cons. The key advantage I see here is that this position acknowledges the irreducible status of normativity, but without having to give it any role. Okay, so it's because just labeling something, a trajectory, to be within the zone of viability doesn't make any difference to how that trajectory unfolds. That is still determined by the state space equations. And phenomenologically, the intrinsic version is still in tension with our experience of acting normatively. Okay, so it's not just that we attribute to other people that they act normatively, but we experience ourselves as doing so too. So it has this first-person quality, which is better explained by assuming that normativity is something intrinsic rather than extrinsic. So the intrinsic version does better in this sense, but it has then the price of facing the problem of naturalization. So how is it possible that we have this intrinsic perspective? And as far as I can see, the best move here is to assume some kind of mind-body identity. Right? So we just say that some physical process just is normative, although this identification makes no difference for the unfolding of the physical process. So it's in that sense a kind of dualism, but it could be like a dual aspect monism or something like that. And it allows the natural sciences and allows us to talk about normativity, and there's a little clash here. But ultimately, in my point of view, this position still falls short of doing justice to our experience of acting because of normative criteria as such, right? So if you imagine like the agent moving in its trajectory in the viability region, right? I would like to say that it stays within the region because it's good for it to maintain itself, or something like that, right? Rather than to say because its state equations force it to stay within that region, right? So there's still a little bit of a tension here. So that brings me then to the strong yes. In strong yes, normativity matters because it is a qualitative aspect of the activity, and this makes a difference to how it will unfold quantitatively. Thus, a complete quantitative description of how an activity will unfold is impossible in principle, right? Because we have this qualitative element that is somehow mixed in with the quantitative story. In this case, the status of normativity is that it's an intrinsic property of the agent. And the goal of science should be to investigate how material processes could be non-deterministic and incomplete, as detailed above, and how normative descriptions could help to complete them. And some examples of this position are Cartesian substance dualism, Hans Jonas's work, von Uxkull's biosemiotics, perhaps Kaufmann in some passages, perhaps Deacon in some passages. So what are the pros and cons of this? Well, the key advantage is that the strong claim that norms make a difference as such to how our bodies move is fully consistent with our experience and with the basis of our society. But this position faces the extremely difficult challenge of explaining how this is possible. How can normative criteria make a difference for processes in the physical world? Already the very claim that they can make a genuine difference contradicts most versions of naturalism. For example, it violates the assumption of the causal closure of the universe because it implies that normativity can lead to events that are underdetermined by the physical history of the universe, right? So we're not dealing with state-determined systems anymore. One way of visualizing such a normative event would be a moment in which the trajectory of an agent's current state wears off its otherwise dynamically determined path. This would mean that the physical world is inherently non-deterministic and that its dynamical description will always remain, in principle, incomplete. Right, so there's something here that is not captured by the state equations, which would be an evaluative judgment or something of something subjective, something qualitative, which then has an impact of some kind. But for many, these changes to our scientific worldview are too heavy a price to pay to shift from a moderate to a strong yes. And yet there are scattered clues that we may have to take this option more seriously than has been done in the past. And now I'm going to kind of go a bit quickly over some examples. So in GoFi, this is the representational paradigm. We actually see many problems that have been raised against it over the years. And in general, the root problem is that in principle, there's a failure to logically determine what ought to be done, given what is the fact and what is true. Right? We cannot move from a fact to kind of value statement. Even the embodied cognition, which was a kind of response to these problems, still struggles with the value. How does value enter the system? So here's Pfeiffer's value principle explicitly listed as somehow supposed to guide the system from the outside. But again, many people have pointed out that this is problematic. Here, Michael Anderson is saying there's doubt on whether they were right in the embodied approaches. There's Drive, who's saying that models that talk about this kind of picking up significance having a chance of being realized. And so the inactive response to this has been to say, well, maybe we shouldn't reify value, but we should somehow, make it a intrinsic emergent property of the system, you see it here, kind of like smearing value all over the place rather than having as a special thing. But this also still leaves kind of mysterious, right? Well, what value it really is and what kind of role it plays. There's appeals to Kant's natural purpose, that self-production leads something to be for something. There's appeals to Hans Jonas's needful freedom, that organisms have to keep going because to be going is their very existence. And then several years ago, I tried to propose that these kinds of normativities pose a hard problem for an active AI, and that it's very difficult to see how we can engineer them. Now, one recent example that tries to do justice to this is this paper by Agman and colleagues, where we do have self-production in the Kantian kind of way, and we have possible adaptations to perturbations, so perhaps we can say that the problem has been solved. But still, if you then think about what the system is really doing, we're just back to this kind of trajectory within a state space, right? And is it really what we want to say, that it is good to stay within a certain kind of equilibrium, right? And then what value does it have that we talk about goodness here, rather than just stay with the language of dynamical systems, as Maturana and maybe Villalobos want us to do, right? So coming to a close, so what I would like as a kind of upshot of this considerations is perhaps that we should just be a little bit more careful in the future, and just say that we just don't know, right? What normativity is or how to integrate it. And I think this is why I share Rodney Brooks' vision of artificial life, where he says that perhaps we have all missed some organizing principle of biological systems, or some general truth about them. Perhaps there's a way of looking at biological systems which will illuminate an inherent necessity in some aspect of the interactions of their parts that is completely missing from our artificial system. He says, I'm suggesting that perhaps at this point we simply do not get it. And so I think this kind of critical self-reflection is very healthy here, because of the consequences of the choices that we make. So if we do stay within the moderate yes, it kind of has the effect of undermining the basis for our society and for our self-experience, because everything that happens in the world would already have been predetermined by the previous history of the universe, and our, let's say, desires as such, or our goals as such, or our beliefs as such, would not play any role in how things unfold. So it would mean that we are actually, to some extent, completely powerless in terms of having any influence upon the future of ourselves and about the rest of society. And that seems to be, to me, to be a very heavy price to pay just for having more consistency in our scientific theories. And I think this is a good place to stop the presentation and go to questions. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thanks, Tom. Thanks very much. Just unmute everybody. So we've been fortunate to be joined by Hannah and Marek here, who I'm trying to unmute, but seem to be unable to. Maybe you guys can unmute yourselves. In any case, I see Marek's. Yes, okay, everybody's unmuted. So thanks for the really interesting talk, Tom. I've seen, we've discussed some of these ideas a little bit in the past, and each time I hear you talk about them, I see where you're coming from more and more. As a way to stop presenting, sorry, the dual role of chairing the meeting and partaking is a bit of a challenge. So I thought one place that might be interesting to kick off some discussion around what you've been talking about has to do a little bit with the different domains where we see ideas of normativity. So there's this idea, so it's actually been a recurring theme in the ENSO seminars themselves, but on the topic of autonomy, where we see autonomy in a bunch of different domains. We see autonomy talked about at the biological level, so autonomous organisms. But people have also given talks about autonomous social structures, or autonomous interactions between people, or autonomous behavioral patterns like habits and so on. And I think it's really, really interesting to think that normativity also has this property where it really seems applicable in a wide variety of domains. There seems to be something consistent and similar, this idea of there being, good and bad in social contexts or ethical contexts or biological contexts. And to me, that's something that's quite appealing and suggests that maybe an action and a focus on autonomy is going the right direction towards understanding normativity. And I was just curious if you had anything to say about, because in your talk, you mentioned at one point this, and when you were talking about the pros and cons for the mild yes, you said that it was sort of an untenable or an unstable position because it itself involved a normative claim. Right. But it seems to me like there's different levels of normativity that are going on here. There's perhaps a biological level, and then there's like this scientific domain in which there's a normative measure of some kind. And I'm just curious what you think about the fact that normativity does appear in all of these different domains. Do you think it's there's one. Yeah, I'll leave it there. I won't prompt you any further.
Okay. Well, first of all, yeah, thank you for the clarification. You're absolutely right that there are many kinds of normativity, and I try to get the broadest possible characterization of it because I think this challenge applies to all of them. But let's say as sociocultural norms have certain differences from biological norms, for sure. Okay, and it's important to think about what those differences are. And what I'm struggling a little bit is trying to distill what is the common essence of all these different kinds of normativity. And I'm not sure exactly whether someone has done this work, but I'm not even sure what the right term would be, right? Subjective seems too loaded, value seems too loaded, you know, so a norm, of course, also has this ambiguity, as you point out. So I'm left a little bit without words to talk about this difference that I'm trying to point out, but it has something to do with, on the one hand, we have a purely quantifiable picture in which you know, certain kinds of equations determine what will happen next, or we can describe what happens in these equations in terms of what happens next. And then there seems to be qualitative issues about, for example, good versus bad, succeeding versus failing, achieving something or not, doing something for a reason, you know, all kinds of, or like a function performing, you know, properly, or there's all kinds of different kinds of normativity there. Don't know exactly how to group them together, but there's definitely something different about them compared to purely quantifiable phenomena in my mind. And so autonomy is a good way of trying to think about that difference. And you know, it's not a coincidence that I'm you know, bringing this up, given that the long history of our group did research on autonomy. And to some extent, I could give another talk where I just talk about autonomy having the same kind of problems that I'm facing here. So, for example, I'm not sure whether we really understand how we could have something like self-production in an autopoietic sense described in a normal dynamical system. It seems to be a very, very big challenge to build in that self-reference and this constructive aspect that brings out something new that wasn't there somehow already before, or you know, not pre-existing, but somehow prefigured in what was there before. Mm-hmm. So this kind of qualitative newness of bringing yourself out, like bootstrapping yourself out of previous conditions, it's totally mysterious, really. I mean, you know, we sometimes just saying autopoiesis sometimes hides the mystery a little bit, but I don't think we really understand properly, scientifically, what's going on there, right? It seems that this notion of non-determinism that I mentioned here, or this incompleteness already apply here, because as soon as you have self-reference, you know, these kinds of issues of incompleteness start playing a role. And so, and value goes immediately with that too. So Hans Jonas, you know, thinks about self-production as the source of all values, because once you have a system separating itself from its background and self-producing its own conditions of survival, it seems to be in a position, now this is anthropomorphizing a bit, but again, we lack the language. It seems to be in a position now to have a choice. Either I keep doing what I'm doing, and therefore I stay far away from equilibrium and maintain myself, or I just say, I don't care, and I just fall back into the equilibrium state and disintegrate. And life, in general, has the tendency to choose to put in the work and the effort to stay away from equilibrium, rather than just saying, you know what, I can't be bothered, and I'll just collapse and back into the equilibrium. So that already seems to be implying some kind of value, perhaps, right? That one kind of outcome seems to be preferred over another. Again, it seems too strong, but that's for him, that was, you know, to some kind like the origin of God. So what I'm trying to point out here is that this is a, you know, philosophical problem, but in the case of autonomy, it's maybe a more concretely scientific problem, but they're very closely related.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I guess that that takes me to one other sort of comment that I had, and then maybe Marek or Hannah have a question or comment that they want to throw in as well, which is related to this idea. You talk about norms as being the possibility of them being emergent in some sense. And at least the way I've been thinking about them, again, relates to the way that I've been thinking about autonomy, which is instead of thinking about it as being an emergent property of some kind, it being sort of system property or an organizational property that is describing the way components are related to each other. So, you know, with autonomy, you know, we've talked 1,000 times before about this idea of a network of interdependent processes. And then for me, the idea of normativity comes from a more specific way that those network of interdependent processes are organized, which I don't want to go into in too much detail, but it seems to me like it's possible. Let's see, what slide was it? You had a slide of pros and cons of the moderate approach, and you said some physical processes are normative. And I got the impression that you were suggesting there that it was sort of an arbitrary distinction, that we would just arbitrarily say this is a normative process. Whereas what I am imagining is that there could be a principled way of saying this particular system has this particular organization, which is one that fits our definition of a normative organization, or the organization of a system that has norms. And then that fits with this idea of different domains, and we could see that organization at multiple levels. We could see it at a biological level, or we could see it at some socio-cultural level or interactive level. Yes. So I just had that as a comment. It's not necessarily an emergent thing, but perhaps an organizational thing. Does that?
I think that's the best we can do at the moment, I think, right? So before we have a good theory, we need to categorize you know, what systems actually are the ones that are interesting or can help us resolve this issue, right? And so finding certain organizational criteria, for example, which seem to pick out the class of phenomena that have some sort of, that we would be inclined to describe normatively, is already like a necessary step, I think, right, to become closer to this. But ultimately, I think the hard problem still remains, because let's say in your model, right, if you have an organizational property there that seems to be very specific and that lends itself to be described normatively, but then when you think about what the trajectory in the state space of the agent is really determined by, it's the set of equations that moment by moment, you know, determine what's the next step of the system. And so then on that level of description, you're suddenly left with no difference anymore between that kind of system and a system that you wouldn't describe normatively at the level of its organization, right? So there's actually at that bottom level, suddenly they're just the same again. And so I don't know, right? So if we want somehow for these organizational higher level normative properties to make a difference for how we behave, we somehow have to find a way for them to have an effect on how things unfold at the bottom level. But we don't have a good account of that either. That goes down, you know, there are all these problematic notions of strong emergence or downward causation or reciprocal causation. I mean, there's all these words, right? But I mean, formally, we have absolutely no idea how to do that, right? It's just redescribing the higher level in terms of what's happening, but actually we have a full, complete description at the bottom level. And there's no, I don't know, there's no way in which we can talk about that the organizational properties directly influence what's going on at that level, right? It's just something implicit, or I don't know. Anyway,
I do feel like there's a difference. So when you talk about those equations as describing the trajectory of the system, some of the variables in those equations, or some of the equations themselves, will be associated with the system that will or will not persist, the agent, and some of them will not be. Some of them will be some of those processes that are described by those equations or variables will persist whether or not the agent does. And so there is a way, I think, to say that if some of these variables that are associated with the normative processes that are inside the agent are contributing to what happens, well, then that's a sense to which they do matter. And I think it's okay. I think it's possible to have an entirely deterministic system where there's a variety of things that are influencing the trajectory. Some of those are associated with the agent, where the agent is distinguished by being the thing that persists or doesn't persist depending on its actions. And so I think this is maybe one place where you and I disagree a little bit, is on this idea. I mean, it comes down to pretty much determinism as I see it, whereas the deterministic nature of the way we're describing these systems makes you uncomfortable and makes you feel like there's not room for normativity and agency, whereas I guess I don't share that concern to the same extent.
Right, the determination on the level of, let's say, quantitative processes, right? There could still be determination in the sense that, you know, I want something to happen, therefore it happens, right? So, but that would be like kind of psychological determination, which wouldn't be captured at the level of physics, right? And the other thing is that we have to be careful here not to fall back into this kind of value system idea that you know, people like Pfeiffer had talked about, where of course we can draw a box somewhere, or like, you know, select some equations, as you say, and say that's the value. And if this equation goes up, it means it's good, and then the agent is supposed to do something, right? So
I totally agree.
That's also not okay.
That's absolutely something. I mean, that's one of my long-term goals, is to figure out how we can avoid drawing that box. I completely agree. This whole value system sort of sidesteps the problem or postpones the problem, the interesting problem.
Right.
Yeah. So we see eye to eye there for sure.
Good.
Marek or Hannah, do you have any questions or comments that you want to throw in?
Not yet. Lots of thoughts, but not really a well-formulated question from me. Okay,
well, Marek, you're a psychologist. Say something.
I've just noticed that Marek is frozen here, at least in his image.
Yes.
So I wonder if he's been lost or had to run for some reason. Just checking my email. No. Okay. Well, hopefully he'll come back here.
Okay, so here's the challenge, right? Just continuing our conversation for the moment. And Hannah, this also applies to you, right? Because of course I took the diagrams about the value system and you know, the value being something emergent from your paper. It's really difficult for me to properly try to understand what it means to just write value in big letters across the system, right? I kind of get the didactical message here that it's not supposed to be reified, right? It's not a thing inside the system or a variable inside the system, right? But what is the alternative, right? If it's just something, I don't know, you know, smeared across the system, but we don't really know how it interacts with the rest of the functioning of the system, then maybe we're better off to go with Mario Villalobos' proposal that actually, you know, at the level of dynamics, there's just structural coupling and that's it. And the rest is just something that, you know, it's attributed at the level of, you know, I don't know, social interactions or something like that, but it doesn't play any role at that level, which, as I said in the talk, I don't like that option either, because it's kind of like empowers, you know, because it makes us powerless to, you know, influence our own behavior. And then basically, you know, the science would tell us that when I talk with you, whatever I say makes no difference to you, right? You would just behave as you behave, you know, based on your structural coupling, and that's it. Whether I'm right or wrong will make no difference. Whether you like me or not will make no difference, right? It's just the structural dynamics. And that seems to be a very pessimistic, you know, point of view to my mind. So that's the other extreme, right? So we can't make the value system one work properly. Can't make the other extreme nihilistic point of view properly, and the middle ground is really hard to defend. And I think that but what's healthy for me is to just that I actually came to this realization, because for a long time I thought that we had it solved, right? So that we somehow, by talking about autopoiesis and autonomy and like writing value in big letters across our system, we actually understood now what value is, right? And I think you know, now I'm not so sure anymore that we really know what it means. And so who knows, maybe that uncertainty is just like, you know, the step to another breakthrough, hopefully, you know, or, you know, at the end of the day, it's also possible to be something that is not perhaps explainable in scientific terms. I mean, I'm not wedded to the idea that everything in the entire reality has to be explainable by science, right? That kind of scientism also doesn't appeal to me. If there are some things that cannot be explained, well, so be it. I mean, what's the problem, right? That doesn't mean that we should stop trying, right? But it also means that we shouldn't settle for answers that are not fully consistent or fully satisfactory either. In that case, we might be better off, like Brooks saying, at this point, we just don't get what normativity really does, right? And just be honest and explicit about it, and at least, you know, by having this open wound, festering wound, you know, say we don't know, at least maybe it will propel us faster forward in our thinking than just sticking with what more, let's say, more loose talk about the issue. I see, Marek, you're back. I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about this, because I think you had a paper like a while back about enactivists do things for a reason or something like that. Or so how do you see this topic now?
Oh no, we can't hear you, Marek. And I don't think it's because you're muted. Is it possible your microphone is? If your question's not long, you can type it to me, Marek, and I can pass it on to Tom. No, it's not working, unfortunately. Maybe Marek, while you're waiting or trying to figure out your microphone, I can make a proposal to you, Tom, or sort of a question to try to figure out why. I guess I think you'll be dissatisfied with what I'm proposing, and I'm curious, but I don't quite know why.
Okay.
So in that paper that Xavier and I wrote a while ago, that you had a diagram from, the title is something like norm establishing and norm following, something. Norm establishing and norm following an autonomous agency. And part of the idea there is that, you have this system which has this organization, and that organization implies a set of norms, right? A set of things that are good or bad for the system. And then the idea is that it's possible for the system to respond rather directly to what those norms are. Now, maybe not perfectly directly, but this is where I find the idea of metabolism-based behavior interesting, because to me, it's a concrete example of how you can have a system, such as a bacterium, that has a particular organization that defines what it needs to persist or not persist, or partially defines. And then it can respond to things like its electron transport system. It can respond to these variables that are they're not exactly equivalent to its norms, but they're variables that are really, really highly correlated with and really strongly associated with whether or not the system's going to survive. So if if its metabolism starts to fail, then it's just guaranteed to die. And the current state of its metabolism is a way of indicating how healthy it is. And it can respond to those things in a very direct causal way. Now, I know that doesn't sidestep the deterministic part of your argument, but ignoring that part of your concern for now, it seems to me like this is a way to naturalize the concept of normativity in terms of a form of organization, where you have a set of variables that define the system that's going to survive or not, and then that system can or cannot have a further organization that allows it to respond to its own health. And that means that you can have an autonomous system that either follows norms or one that doesn't. And so it's this sort of additional system property that allows us maybe to get normativity. But I imagine you're unsatisfied with that somehow.
No, I mean, I like I said, I mean, for me, this is, to some extent, this is the state of the art, right? And I'm trying to say that in a genuinely positive way. So I think really you're making progress by thinking about things this way. But just let me try to see why I would say that still there's something philosophically concerning here, and maybe it's because it's hard to understand whether the agent can really genuinely fail at doing something, right? So, and this goes back to determinism, because with the same initial conditions, right, and you run it again, it will always do the same action, right? And so it seems like the idea that some of its behaviors could succeed or fail with respect to its maintenance is actually just a very loose way of talking, because there's actually no choice here, right? There's no genuine autonomy in the sense that it could do something that might lead to something that it would not want, like dying, right? So that kind of language seems to be implied when we talk normatively here, right? That it should be doing something, right? But actually that's not true, because everything is fixed from the start of the simulation. So that's, for me, still, at least if we talk about normativity here, it would be a different sense than when the philosophers talk about normativity, where it's the ought, ought to be doing something, should be doing something, it's better to do that, seems to imply a possibility of failure or of doing something different, right? Which doesn't seem to be given in our simulation models.
Okay, so I see what you're saying.
So Marek is online.
Marek is back. Okay, let's have your question, Marek.
I have a working mic now. So great. First of all, Tom, lovely to see you, and also thank you very much for the talk. There's a lot of thinking. There's a lot of thinking been triggered by it. So I'm going to start with what I think is a well-formed question, which I hope so anyway, which is just to ask you to clarify your use of terms just a tad. So you've made the distinction between the qualitative and the quantitative. And crucially, the sort of the vital distinction, as I understand the way you've used the terms, is that the quantitative can never exhaust the qualitative. That there is something unquantifiable about the qualitative.
That's right.
Is that fair? Is there a better way of thinking about or considering the way you're?
No, I think that let's just say that's true. Okay, so let's say that I'm saying that. Yes.
So let's say so then I have what I'm wondering about is whether the quantitative description of the universe that has you concerned about determinism,
right,
is not a complete description of the universe. In particular, so what we normally take autonomy and organizational closure and so on, these things that enactivists use as the on switch for normativity. What we normally take those things as providing is the beginnings of asymmetry, right? Some form of encapsulation which brings into the universe a perspective.
That's right.
And once you've got perspective, you're dealing with the universe in two terms, from two different points of view. Yours, the observers, and secondly, the system in question.
That's right.
Norms occur within the perspective of the system in question, not within yours necessarily as the external observer. And to say that.
Say that again. Wait. This is the part. So.
Okay, so yeah, this is the crucial bit. So this is, and if I'm getting this wrong, we're wrong. But to my mind, normativity essentially must take the perspective of the system. That's where the norms are. It's within the system's universe, not ours, the observer's universe.
So you're saying it's intrinsic to the system being observed?
Yes.
Okay.
So the norms.
I would push back on that. No.
So it's a question of whether. So I'm not sure if this is I guess it's the question of what I'm seeing is it's essentially your moderate yes, but it's your moderate yes in which we get a satisfactory phenomenology.
Okay.
So I think, for example, of I owe some of this thinking to Fred Cummins, but if you think, for example, of time, the time in our equations is clock time. It's we can stipulate time in terms of a given second or moment or date, using the parameters of standardized time measurement. But for the system, there is also now. Time from my perspective.
Yes.
And the external observation of the universe cannot describe now. It's always using a system. So insofar as there is an incapacity of our external descriptions to capture the perspective or certain aspects of the perspective of the agent, then those external descriptions are incomplete. And as such, the determinism of them is not necessarily threatening unless we consider unless we demand strong yes. If a moderate yes is okay, then the deterministic dynamical universe still allows space for the normative universe, because the deterministic dynamical universe remains incomplete.
you agree with the incompleteness then, right? So
yeah,
you haven't considered that. So possibly we could say that it's a deterministic yet incomplete account, and it's incomplete because perspectives have properties that cannot be captured in a quantitative or physical
and
way.
also,
Or something like that.
right, and also the fact that any science must be conducted from a perspective. So we as the scientists cannot encompass the universe because the universe is just bigger than us.
Right. So self-reference becomes an issue.
Yeah.
But Marek, I really like the word perspective that you brought into this discussion, actually. I mean, that's actually maybe the kind of word that I was looking for earlier in this conversation. Like, what's the common denominator? Perspective could be one, point of view. But something happens with respect to something. And that's a kind of point of view, perspective, and that somehow sits outside of that which is being observed. That's true. Okay.
But also sits within every observation too. That's the your second order cybernetics stuff. So there's kind of one other observation that I'd make. I mean, just loads we could talk about, but there's one that I'm kind of curious to get your response to, I suppose, which is that in each of the descriptions and in all of the examples that you've given, there's almost kind of am I being fair, I guess, in my perception that there's an implicit assumption running that norms emerge from within the agent, or must be kind of within the agent in some way. And I'm kind of you mentioned a paper I wrote many years. So this was sort of back in the old my naive PhD days, which was an active theorist do it on purpose was the name. But there's a more recent paper which I might direct you towards called Situated Agency, which draws a little bit on. There's a paper that you and Hannah wrote it was published in 2009 actually. In which there's kind of a nice examination of social agency, in which you kind of point out that being engaged in the field of social normativity doesn't just add to individual agency, it transforms it from the ground up.
Right.
Or indeed from the top down, one or the other. And I guess what I'm wondering is in the case of most forms of normativity that we might observe in our world, in the world around us, in any given case, that normativity emerges within a pre-existing ecosystem. So it's almost like I've used the analogies before that we like to build our agents like Lego bricks. We sort of start from nothing and add the Lego together until we come up with something interesting, and we think then value either shows up in the whole finished piece of Lego, or worse, the value is one of the Lego bricks we put in, right? But is a better analogy for how normativity arises a zygote, which then differentiates into a whole different group of cells. In that case, you've got value maintained in the set of relations between all of the system, but you're never adding things from outside of the system. So you take an Evo-Devo notion of, value exists in the ecosystem, and an individual agent might emerge within that ecosystem, inheriting certain kinds of values, but bringing other new possibilities to bear. And in any situation in which we try to look for normativity arising kind of ab initio from either within an agent or directly within an agent in its environment, we've kind of missed the longer temporal dimension of development. In which there are a lot of norms that pre-exist the organism. We are born into a field of norms.
I don't get that. Can I ask you to clarify that, Marek? What do you mean there's a lot of norms?
So any organism that is, I know there's really important origins of life stuff that I'm going to slide past, but in sort of any modern case, right, you've got any organism that is born of parents. Those parents exist in an ecosystem that has a whole sort of collection of interwoven norms, and in essence, there's part of developing and becoming a mature agent within that ecosystem means adopting and coordinating with the norms. So I don't, a human child has, all of our biological norms are tempered and conditioned by the civilization and community to which we belong. And you can tell similar stories in an evo-devo kind of way for any collection of, for any given animal, not necessarily a human one. And it's that outside inward emergence of norms rather than inside outward that I think is missing from each of the three ways in which normativity tends to be described. It was always like, well, how does the organism do norms? Well, the organism gets norms handed to them. And
but it seems to me like you're talking about norms, like going back to sort of my first comment to Tom, in different domains, right? Like the norms you're talking about in the ecosystem are the norms of the ecosystem, not of the agent.
Right.
And you're talking about interaction between these norms, which is a totally fascinating area of inquiry. But I don't, can't we think about norms? I don't know what my point is. It just that's all my point is that you're talking about norms in different domains interacting with each other.
So yeah, right. So, but I guess it's a question then of is the origin of life the origin of norms? And if that's the case, we keep looking for life in the thing, in the organism. And well, Tim Ingold's got this lovely quote of life isn't in things, things are in life. If it's, I guess it's a way of trying to discipline that notion that the value is smeared over the system, right? That there is I get, Tom, I get your wariness of that. And I think at the moment, for the main part, in a lot of ways, that is it's an intuition rather than an argument. That it's like that's where we'll find it. It's not in the organism. It's not bubbling up out of them, and it's not. They don't have a value box. But So I guess I'm going to just babble at this point. So I think really, in essence, the phrase I'm going to sort of push is, evo-devo. Think about developmental systems, and it gives you a different perspective on what you look for in normativity and how you think normativity gets into an organism, as it were.
Yes. So let me respond to 2 points here. One point you said, is the origin of life the origin of normativity? And actually, that's something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. And maybe, it's one way of thinking about it, maybe it's not a coincidence that the origin of life is such a scientifically intractable problem, right? So, people have been working on it for, I don't know, like a century, let's say, like, something with more or less modern scientific tools. And yet there's a sense in the field that, ultimately, really we don't get it. We can explain parts of it, and there's this hypothesis, but really there's still a big mystery here of how it came about. And of course, if it's true that the origins of life was also the origins of normativity, then maybe one reason why we don't get the full picture through chemistry alone or geochemistry is precisely because we're missing the normativity, right? And so I don't know exactly what that would mean, what kind of implications it would have in the fields of origins of life research. What would it mean to try to take into account normativity when doing that kind of research? But let's just say that it's quite interesting that that boundary between from non-life to life, right, seems such a problematic boundary to cross with the traditional methods. And the second response to you is that you said about, how can we have an account that's consistent with the phenomenology, right? So this goes back to what you said at the beginning. And acknowledging that the description of the universe is incomplete because it can never be complete because of the observer and so on. But also there's a worry on my part that maybe my phenomenology is wrong, right? So another way out of this whole dilemma would be to say, let's stick with the classical scientific philosophy of science of the universe, but what has to change is our self-understanding. And this is why perhaps Buddhism, for example, was so attractive to Varela, right? Because if you adopt a metaphysics in which everything just happens because it happens, and there are no selves, and You know, you're not really in control of how things unfold. Well, if that's the more accurate description of our phenomenology, rather than this kind of folk psychological description that I was giving, well, then also the dilemma is resolved, right? Because then we don't need to expect that there's any influence from the level of norms down to the level of unfolding behaviors, because there is no such influence, right? And even our experience, there shouldn't be any influence. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. And it doesn't really address the problem that if we go down that route, we basically undermine the foundations of our society, where everything, we always assume that things happen for a reason. We do things for a reason because we believe things to be true, because we desire things, because we want things, right? So if suddenly we have to throw out all of that, well, you know, I don't know. You know, that's a very drastic change, right? I mean, at least the change I'm proposing is just to change our philosophy of science, right? And you know, to make it more in line with how we understand ourselves in our modern world. Whereas going into changing the phenomenology to say, actually, our self-impression is the wrong one, and actually everything just happens and there's no reason for it. That's much more drastic than what I'm proposing. And which way is the correct way to go in the end, I'm not sure. So it's good that that at least we know that there's this other alternative. But you know, what would be interesting is in my mind, is to make this work in such a way that we can still somehow treat each other as agents, in the sense that we do things because we desire them, because we have goals and so on, and that these mental phenomena make a difference for how we behave. Right, and if you can't make that work, well, that's a very extreme change in our philosophical outlook, right, in our worldview. And so I think at the moment, that's why my inclination is to say that something has to give on the side of the scientific worldview of the universe. Maybe it doesn't have to be non-deterministic. Maybe incompleteness is sufficient. But even the non-determinism, I don't think is so problematic. I have some other slides in the talk that I didn't present, but actually there are many philosophers of science that say, actually, yes, you know, the universe is non-deterministic, right? And so that at least wouldn't be an issue. So, but yes, thank you. So you at least you helped me to specify what I'm trying to say here, and your temporal example is very useful, right? So the fact that from the point of view of physics, actually, you know, everything already has happened from past to future, and all we're doing is, like, you know, looking at this overview, and now it's completely arbitrary, right? Whereas from our point of view, everything is just now, and past and future is somehow constructed and arbitrary, and to bring these two together is kind of impossible, right? So that's one way in which we can think about the incompleteness of the scientific worldview.
I know Hannah wants to jump in here, but on the basis of what you're saying there, I'll just quickly plug Fred Cummins' work. He gave a talk, and it's archived online just last week, actually. I think and if you look for Gateless Gate blog, Gateless Gate. He did a sort of a long talk in which some of this stuff really it's worth. Treat yourself. It's long, but so go and have a look, and you'll see he was covering sort of some of this kind of ground. So sorry, Hannah.
Okay.
It's okay. Yeah, don't worry. I'm not visible, so it's harder. I can't put up my hand, but yes, I do have a comment. First of all, I mean, I think well, the last thing you said, Tom, was about how it's impossible to bring together the now from the I perspective and the now from the observer perspective. And what you said, Marek, about the whole view being incomplete because we have perspectives which we cannot account for scientifically, this now perspective in time. And I think that's very insightful. But I think, I have an intuition that it is possible to do that, to connect these two, if we have a truly intersubjective epistemology. So if we could, so there are things that come together which we can only bring together if it's a living being to a living being knowing each other. This is also what Jonas says, life knows life. But for this we need to change science, I think. So I think if you say science can't capture it, I would say not yet, because we don't have a properly engaged epistemology yet. And I think when you said that we smear value in that diagram, we smear value all over the system. That is an expression of you saying that is an expression of the frustration at what we theoretically have to do. What we do, if you call it smearing, that's something that we do theoretically. But the point of the diagram is it is all over for the system. It's not us smearing it all over. It is value permeates it all. And the only way we can truly meet that and know it is if we engage as a living being to a living being. And that means acknowledging that when we know, the thing that we know changes, and we do too, in the moment where we know. And that would be a truly intersubjective epistemology. And I think that's what we need to tackle this problem. And we don't get it yet because we don't have that yet, I think.
Okay, let me think about that. 2 points. So, of course, I agree with you that to some extent a new science is needed, right? And so when I criticize science here, actually I'm critiquing a specific view of science that might be like mainstream philosophy of science mainly, right? So that there's the causal closure of the universe, there's all these just material processes, and that's like the foundational layer, and everything else is just derivative but can ultimately be collapsed down the levels, right? So that's the kind of science that I'm trying to criticize. What you're proposing seems much more in tune with a kind of relaxed naturalism, where psychological process, subjective processes are not outside the natural order. They're part of it, and that is not a problem. We can also study them scientifically, right? So Varela's neurophenomenology, to some extent, was exactly that, right? Saying, let's just stop metaphysical speculation for a moment and just recognize that my mental processes that I experience and my body process that I can measure directly are just two kinds of processes that unfold in time and that can be interrelated, right? So that kind of relaxed naturalism, I think, is exactly right and is what we need in order to move forward. Now about the value and the smearing, yeah, so smearing has a kind of negative connotation, right? So, so I'm sorry about that. But the thing here is that when you say that it is just all over the system, it goes to something where I said in the talk that this hasn't been made explicit as such somewhere, I think, or correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to suggest a kind of mind-body identity theory, right? So that the unfolding of the processes in this type of system, and then we can specify what type we're talking about. It has to be autopoietic, adaptive, da-da-da-da-da. When those processes happen in those kind of systems, they are value-laden, or they are, to some extent, imbued with subjectivity. But you see that the weight of the argument then becomes the identification, right? It is that. And so it's actually identifying something that is subjective with something that is objective, and putting it somehow into a mixture, and that's fine. That's a perfectly justifiable strategy, and if it is that, maybe it would be useful to actually just make that explicit somewhere and say what kind of mind-body identity theory is enactivism promoting or offering. But if we go down that route, it still then gives some ammunition to people, let's say, like Villalobos or Maturana or whoever, who say then, well, in that case, what explanatory work does the value or the subjective aspects actually do, right? Because you're just saying what's happening here is also at the same something that is value, like, value for the system. But really, we're having also at the same time a complete dynamical description or material description of the unfolding processes. And it seems like we could just have the one without the other, right? So now it's just down to intuition. So do we imagine the possibility of a philosophical zombie? Yes or no? Some people will say, well, no, I can't imagine that, because when it has this organization, it must also have value at the same time or be valuable, right? So this is the kind of identity theory, perhaps. Whereas other people say, well, no, there's nothing logically binding to that commitment, and we could just assume that you could have exactly Tom sitting here undergoing all these physical processes without any kind of subjective dimension to it. And in order to avoid that kind of argument, it would be useful to show what difference does the value make to the unfolding of the system. And then if that's true, if there is a difference, then the philosophical zombie argument won't work anymore, right? Because then you say, no, as soon as you have subjectivity, it's not comparable anymore to a purely physical version of the same system. There will be something else going on that is not happening in the purely physical system. So I'm not saying that I have any answers, but I just, it would be probably useful to see whether you, Ezekiel, and well, Marike, who wrote the original paper, if you were willing to commit to saying that what you're doing is proposing an identity theory, or if you have something different in mind.
Well,
and you personally, where do you stand there?
I would like to say that having to have a mind-body identity theory comes only if you have separated mind and body first. Then you need an identity theory, and then and that might be a red herring.
Yes. So I'm trying to think here also about Evan Thompson's work on the mind-body-body problem, and I guess he also would agree with you to some extent. He doesn't talk about intersubjectivity, but we could phrase it like that. So subjectivity comes first, the lived body comes first, our life world comes first, intersubjectivity comes first, and then from within this perspective that we all share, we can talk about physics in isolation. We can talk about subjectivity in isolation. And then once we've done that, we face the problem of how do we bring them together again. Whereas from our own lived perspective, that distinction doesn't exist, right? We are our bodies directly.
Exactly.
That's true. That's a kind of phenomenological resolution to the problem.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think asking that we need to show what difference value makes is also based on that red herring, and rather I think the question could be, we know that value permeates everything if just from our own perspective or from the perspective of interacting with loved ones, say, our phenomenology is such that we know that. Even if perhaps we can't always talk about it with other people, but there are situations and experiences where we do know how much difference that can make. And we have very strong and deep intersubjective experiences of that. And then the question is not what difference does value make, but what difference does this situation make, or this context to what I'm doing now, and then it's about what happens within the world in which value just is everything.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, Hannah, that's of course exactly where I'm coming from. That's the motivation, right? So let's say that how you behave with your loved ones, you want the love to make a difference for how you're behaving, right? That's just a natural thing. I mean, it's not even something that we would question if you're not having this philosophical discussion right now, right? It's just taken for granted, right? And so the point is that if the philosophy or the science can't do justice to that, right, it's the philosophy of the science that has to change and not our life, right? So I completely agree with that. And to some extent, what I'm trying to point out is that within this traditional point of view, let's say not starting from the life world perspective, okay, so we agree there, the traditional point of view can't do justice to our experience, right? And so at least if we get that point right, then my hope is that, well, two possibilities, right? One, we just realize that science is something different from our personal life, right? And that's already a very healthy realization in itself. And the second is that maybe there could be a different kind of science that allows us to justice to both, right? And you suggested that taking intersubjectivity as a starting point would be one way of going about it. So I agree with both of those. And I also agree with that we don't know yet what the shape of that science is, right? So that was another kind of point of the talk I was trying to give, is that really we simply do not get it yet. And just starting from a chronological, sorry, yes.
And yet I think it's true that we do not get it yet, but I think also we do get it. As humans, we get it. Not yet as scientists, but as humans we do.
Right.
And so we need a humane science of all this, that recognizes what we know as humans.
Yes,
in a way.
I completely agree. So there's no mystery, when you're in the moment, right? It's not like, how am I supposed to know that she loves me or something like that, right? And then you start reflecting about it and saying, what thought could be in her mind that could cause the action? No, okay, that doesn't happen, right?
No,
so in that sense, there's no... It can also happen, right? Okay, but this goes a little bit off topic right now, but once we go to, let's say, assuming a chronological starting point, and a starting point in the life world and our experiences and so on, that also creates then certain tensions with the scientific worldview that, I mean, we could have given the talk from a different perspective. Here I kind of started from the scientific worldview and said that it has tensions with trying to talk about normativity, but we could also talk it from the other way around and say when we start from the phenomenology of our life world, that brings tensions with the scientific worldview. For example, the best science that we have right now tells us that there was a time before subjects even existed, right? And to question that, right, that there was a time when there was no value, there was no subjectivity, would be like, crazy for most scientists, right? So that's completely inconceivable, right? And also, if I want to get into that kind of thought, it's like, well, all of our experimental evidence, the best science, like all points to the possibility that, 4 billion years ago, before the origins of life, there was no subjectivity, but there was a universe, right? And so again, it's not saying, I don't have the answers, but I'm just saying that starting point then again brings us to a similar kind of conflict between something in which we talk about qualitative aspects, subjectivities, values, norms, and something in which there's just something quantitative and objective. And it appears in a different guise, but it's still there. And there are different options here. One is to appeal to some sort of religious metaphysics and say that there's some transcendental, godlike subject that was always there, and it was doing the job of making sure that there was a subjective counterpart to the objective universe. I'm not such a big fan of that point of view myself, but at least it will be internally coherent. Another is to say that actually, what science says, we shouldn't take it seriously, and that is extrapolating from here and now to something that we can't say anything about, and so we should be skeptical about the possibility that there was something before subjects. But that kind of skepticism also seems weird, right? I mean, then suddenly everything is up in the air. Like, how can we be sure that we didn't just spring up into existence right now, right? And all our memories are already in place, but like 5 minutes ago, we just didn't exist, right? Well, we'll never be able to prove whether that is true or not. But it seems weird to get into that kind of ball game of saying, well, actually, maybe our understanding of the past just is completely wrong. So fascinating topics, right? So I see a lot of work remains to be done, both coming from the scientific point of view towards the side of subjectivity, and also, if you want to adopt the subjective starting point, then to show how can we make it coherent with what our best sciences are telling us about the universe. And maybe if you do both at the same time, who knows, maybe we'll find a middle ground at some point that will satisfy both. But that's the open challenge.
I think we need to know then more about being and knowing, how being and knowing hang together, or what is the relationship between them.
That's right. That's Varela wrote a very nice paper, one of my favorites, on that when he was, I think he's still a student, called Not One, Not Two.
Not One, Not Two, yes.
Yes, and it's all about what's the relationship between being and knowing. And by the way, in that paper, he opts for the mysterious option of saying that being is always more than knowing, and therefore knowing can never exhaust being, and therefore there's a certain kind of incompleteness about what we can say about things. So not sure how whether that would satisfy people, but it goes also back to the points that Marek was raising about that we can't escape our perspective.
Well, that has been some fascinating discussion, and I feel like it could continue perhaps for the next week.
Yep.
Quite happily. I really enjoyed it.
I'm really trying hard to resist jumping back in here.
Well, Tom, you already offered to give another talk, basically repeating this argument, but having to do with autonomy. And to be honest, to me, that sounds wonderful as well. So maybe we can book you in for a talk sometime next year.
Yes.
And to be continued between now and then as well, of course. So thanks so much, Tom. Really, really stimulating. And thank you, Hannah and Marek, for joining as well. It's always nice to have some discussion at the end of the talk. It really brings it all to life. And we'll see you next month.
In 2 weeks, is it?
In 2 weeks, it is. That's right. We've got Christian Gukelsberger joining us from Goldsmiths, talking about the role of empowerment maximization and constitutive autonomy, adaptivity, and open-ended development. So thanks again, Tom, and see you soon. Bye for now.
Thank you very much. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.